We are now on the third week of our series on role models from the Bible. And this has really been kind of an interesting exercise for me and for the rest of our staff as we've looked at this and thought about it. So far in the series, we've looked at two Old Testament characters. The first was a woman named Deborah, who was a judge in ancient Israel. And she led Israel to not only to military victory, but also to spiritual renewal. In the era before Israel had kings, they had judges. Deborah was one of those judges. Last week we lifted up Joseph, who was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, right? And each of those 12 sons represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And Joseph was an amazing character. No one like him in the Bible. He was sold into slavery because of the jealousy of 10 of his brothers, but through his character, through his integrity and hard work, he rose to the highest levels of power and influence, even in the nation that at first enslaved him. As I said last week, it's surprisingly hard to find good role models in the Bible. You would think that wouldn't be hard. But just about any character that you can think of has serious and sometimes even fatal flaws. Deborah and Joseph just happen to be exceptions to that. They're both really amazing people. Now today we're going to be moving into the New Testament, and we're going to actually remain in the New Testament for the rest of the summer. And I'm looking forward to some of the characters that we're going to be looking at because they're not ones that always get a lot of attention. Once again, I think we're going to discover that when it comes to role models, even some of the most familiar names in the New Testament have downsides to them. So one of the preachers I was reading this week posed an interesting question. And this was the question. He said, if you were to create a recruiting poster for following Jesus, whose picture would you put on it? What disciple would you use as a kind of the role model of what it means to follow Jesus? Now, obviously, of the 12 original disciples, we can rule out Judas right away, right? So there's one down. He sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. And beyond that, it starts getting kind of complicated because some of the disciples we know very, very little about. We know their names. James the Less and Bartholomew. We really don't know much about them. Peter seems like an obvious choice to put on that poster, since he was the one Jesus said he was going to build his church upon. But we know some things about Peter too. We know, for instance, that on the night of Jesus' arrest, Peter denied even knowing Jesus. Not once, but 3 times. Fear and self-preservation took over, and he forgot everything that he had promised. And when you get right down to it, so did the rest of the disciples. They failed in essentially the same way. They abandoned Jesus in his greatest hour of need. So I'd be hard-pressed to name any of Jesus' original 12 disciples as worthy role models. Now, it's a different story after Pentecost, right? Once they received the Holy Spirit, it was definitely a different story. But in the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's really only one disciple that rises to the top of the list, and that's Mary Magdalene. If anyone's picture deserves to be on that recruitment poster for following Jesus, being a disciple of Jesus, it's her. Unfortunately, through the years, Mary Magdalene's reputation has taken a hit. And it's not through any fault of her own. She's basically just had a lot of bad PR, I guess, is the way I would put it. Because there's just so much negative stuff that's been associated with her. Scholars believe that some of this, the blame for that, goes back to a guy named Pope Gregory the Great. He was active. He was the leader of the church. He was a pope in the 6th century, so the 500s, so a long time ago. And what he did was he conflated Mary Magdalene with the woman described in Luke 7 who washed Jesus' feet with perfume, with her hair. You may remember that story. Luke never says that was Mary Magdalene. But what Luke does tell us in that story is that that woman was a sinner, which probably meant she was a prostitute in that case. Now, if that had been Mary Magdalene, who Luke features in his gospel in a number of different places, scholars are pretty sure Luke would have let us know that's who that was. So Luke doesn't say that that woman was one of Jesus' closest friends and followers. What he does tell us about Mary Magdalene is that she was once healed of 7 demons. That's what we know about her. And that could mean any number of things. It could mean that she suffered from some kind of a seizure disorder. In some other places where there's demon possession involved, it's attributed to demons, kind of like epilepsy, right? It could have meant some kind of a mental illness. It doesn't mean she was a prostitute. Now, I suspect Pope Gregory, like a lot of men in church history, had an ulterior motive for attacking the character of Magdalene. And this is just a hunch on my part. In a church made up exclusively of male leaders, a role model like Mary Magdalene isn't particularly convenient, I wouldn't think. So he needed to do whatever he could to discredit her. So he said she was a prostitute. He said a bunch of other stuff about her too, really. A bunch of other stuff. Her real story, the actual story, is so powerful, so exemplary, that I think he felt like he needed to knock her down a few notches, because if he didn't, with a role model like that, women in the 6th century might have risen up and thought they had a voice in things, right? They might have felt like they had a role in the ministry of the church, just like Mary Magdalene had an important role in the ministry of Jesus. Now, regrettably, that wasn't the last time Mary got slandered. So Pope Gregory wasn't the last one. More recently, you might remember the Broadway musical, the hit musical, also a movie, Jesus Christ Superstar. Mary Magdalene gets portrayed in that in a similar kind of way. And at one point, she sings a song called I Don't Know How to Love Him. It was really popular when I was a kid. It was on the radio. I'm sure you've heard it before. And in that chorus of that song, she says, or in one of the verses, she says, he's just a man. And I've had so many men before in very many ways. He's just one more. There's nothing in the Gospels that would indicate Mary had any kind of relationship with Jesus like that, other than a disciple to a teacher, right? Nothing to indicate anything like that. And yet people continued to slander her. Even more recently, how many of you are familiar with the Da Vinci Code? Right? I read that book when it came out. It was fascinating. It was made into a movie. Tom Hanks starred in that movie. In that book and in that movie, the truth is supposedly revealed about Mary Magdalene, that she was actually secretly married to him, and that she was carrying his baby when he was crucified. That was the supposed truth that was revealed. It is stuff like that that has kept people from seeing Mary Magdalene as she really was, which is an excellent role model for women and men. Not only was Mary Magdalene with Jesus from the very beginning of his ministry in Galilee, she also did more than just sit at his feet and listen. Okay, so we're going to read a number of texts now about Mary Magdalene from the Gospels. The first one is from Luke chapter 8. Soon afterwards, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 men, male disciples, were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Okay, so that's the only mention of that, of anything regarding that in the Gospels. The wife of Herod's steward Chusa, so this was a wealthy woman from a family of power that was in the household of the king of Israel, and Susanna and many others who provided for them being Jesus and the male disciples, out of their resources. So yes, Mary Magdalene was healed and transformed by Jesus. That's not a negative. It's not. That's how it's supposed to work. And you'll also notice, if you track her through the Gospels, that every time her name is mentioned along with the other women that followed Jesus, she's always listed first. She was a leader. And she supported Jesus' ministry financially, along with the other women that Luke names. I've always thought that's a fact that doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves, that it was women that financed Jesus' ministry and that of the 12 disciples. Why women's presence in ministry is still a controversial thing in churches, in many churches, is still beyond me. It really is. I saw a meme on Facebook recently that put it like this. Started out saying, it said, "Dear church," and then it said, "Jesus protected women, empowered women, honored women publicly, released the voice of women, confided in women, was funded by women, celebrated women by name, learned from women, respected women, and spoke of women as examples to follow." Now it's our turn. Mary Magdalene was and is a great role model. She was healed and transformed by Jesus and never left his side. Even when things fell apart, Mary was right there with him. After Jesus' arrest and trial, those 12 men disappeared. They failed completely. They betrayed, denied, and abandoned Jesus. But not the women. Even as Jesus was being crucified, they stayed close, near enough that they could watch what was happening. We read in Mark 15, there were also women looking on from a distance. What they were looking on was the crucifixion. They were watching as Jesus died on the cross. Among them were, once again listed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joses, and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. I think it's funny that Mark throws in another reminder there of who supported Jesus' ministry financially. It was Mary Magdalene and the rest of the women that did that. It wasn't the men. And it also wasn't the men who watched Jesus' crucifixion from a distance so they could see what they did with their master's body, so that they could take care of it, so that they could provide for him a faithful burial, right? They didn't do that either. Even in death, Mary Magdalene didn't abandon Jesus. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are called the Synoptic Gospels, they all kind of tell a very similar story. We learn that Mary Magdalene and some of the other women waited until the morning of the first day of the week, so they waited until Sabbath was passed, and early in the morning they went to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body for burial. In John's Gospel, interestingly enough, that task had already been completed by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus the Pharisee. So it's a little discrepancy in the stories that are told there. And so in John, which is what we're going to read here in just a second, it seems that Mary simply went to the tomb to grieve. That's why she went. She just wanted to be close to the body of her master, like we might go to a grave and grieve. And when she got there, she discovered that the stone was rolled away and the tomb was empty. So naturally, in a panic, she ran and she told Peter and John, two of the leaders of the disciples, what she'd found. They then ran to the tomb and they discovered that the tomb was empty as well. But here's the thing that strikes me. Jesus didn't reveal himself to Peter or John, at least not yet. He could have, but he didn't. That honor was reserved for Mary Magdalene. And we're going to read that story now in John 20. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she said this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, there's so much I love about this scene. Mary Magdalene reacted the way anyone would react if they found that their loved one's body was suddenly missing from its final resting place. Anyone would respond in that way. So she was upset. She was panicked. When she saw someone standing nearby, she assumed that he was a worker, maybe a gardener. And in a panic, she asked if he knew where Jesus' body had been taken. And at that point, the resurrected Jesus didn't try to explain anything. He simply said, "Mary." He said her name. And in that moment, everything changed. And then Mary responded with one word, Rabboni, which means teacher. And what that tells us, it tells us a whole lot about their relationship, doesn't it? Jesus was her rabbi. She was his beloved disciple. There it is. There it is. And Jesus had a job for her to do. She was to carry the message of the resurrection to the rest of the disciples. I don't know if you know what the definition of an apostle is: one who is sent. As a Jesuit priest by the name of James Martin once said, any discussion of women in the church begins with Mary Magdalene. She, not a man, was the first witness of the risen Christ. She, not a man, was the first preacher of the risen Christ. In other words, Mary Magdalene was the first apostle. She was the first one sent by Jesus to share the good news. And Jesus couldn't have chosen a better person or a better role model for the job. Unlike Peter, she didn't make big promises and then fail to see them through. She was faithful. She never gave up. She was generous with her time and her money. And perhaps best of all, she had a story to tell. One of my favorite quotes from The Chosen, which is this television show about Jesus' life and ministry that we've been watching on Wednesday nights during the school year. One of my favorite quotes comes from Mary Magdalene. And when someone who knew her before she began to follow, before she met Jesus, and her life was changed, when he saw the massive change in her life, he asked her about it, what had happened to her. And her response was this: I was one way, and now I am completely different. And the thing that happened in between was him. I love that quote because I think it's something that anyone who's had a life-changing encounter with Jesus might say. Anyone. Mary's story was simple. Jesus transformed her life. He gave her hope and purpose, and she followed him with unwavering loyalty and trust from the beginning of his ministry in Galilee, which she helped to finance, to his death in Jerusalem and beyond. Mary never fell away. When Jesus needed someone to share the earth-shaking news of his resurrection, his choice was easy. It was Mary. Despite the fact that we continue to slander her and share rumors and lies about her life, Jesus chose Mary Magdalene as his apostle. And I can't think of a better role model. She loved Jesus. She was faithful. She was generous, committed, and fearless. May we then go and be like her. May we go and do likewise.